Hello, my name is Alex, and this video is a part of my concept development assignment. The general objective was to deliver paper and digital prototypes based on arcade games from 80s with some corruption, while additional discussing game design theory. Firstly, I got two teams to pick from, Rite of Revolution and Legends of Android. I picked Rite of Revolution as there are more games about war and spies, which I can adapt to a Revolution team. I took my inspiration from a game called Elevator Action. Initially, the game is about a spy, which needs to collect papers from some doors and kill enemy agents. Until I discuss my prototype and changes I have done, you need to know some theories first. What is narrative in games? The narrative in games consists of the plot, sounds, music, atmosphere, dialogues, player choices, and of course gameplay. It creates an overall impression of the game and allows the player to feel like a part of the game. What is corruption in games? Game corruption is a change in mechanics, which will lead to unusual and unique gameplay. As example, in FPS shooters, such as Valorant or CSGO, you may jump. But if I was a game designer who will change jump action to a gravity switch, it will be a corruption, because you do not expect that. Another example is Superhot, where slowing the time down when a player does not move is corruption by itself. Another thing to discuss is the slice of the game. We, as game designers, assume there are two types of it, horizontal and vertical. While vertical tries to discuss mechanics in depth, horizontal tries to get all of them at once. To understand it a little bit better, let's have an example from a popular game, No Man's Sky. As Matthew Ventures in his video suggests, you need to modularize your game by splitting it by nouns that represents items and verbs which represents what these do. While we can adapt to different creatures, we might also acquire different resources and craft different tools. If we take all the creatures, all the craft recipes, and all the tools, it will be a horizontal slice. Vertical slice, on the other hand, would be about adapting one specific creature, getting only one resource, and crafting only one tool. Another theory part to be discussed is the Iterative Approach. It is a development process that consists of out of loops. Each loop is split into 4 steps: creating an ideal concept, developing a prototype, playtest, and evaluating a result. As a result of such approach, designer can work out the full design of a play experience. According to Joel Burgess, senior designer at Bethesda Game Studios, Iterative Approach was being used for Fallout 3 and Skyrim. And other popular examples are Spelunky in the context of visuals, and Team Fortress Spy Agent and his game design implemented features. MDA. Last but not least is Mechanic Dynamic Aesthetics, simply MDA framework. This framework helps us understand what mechanics combinations will lead to achieving a particular feeling of the player. For example, to achieve sensation aesthetics, we need to have at least few audio-visual effects dynamics. To get audio dynamics, we need to create multiple mechanics at levels such as background music as well as environmental sound. As second dynamic, we'll have some visuals. We may create good-looking sprites and VFX as particles and effects. Of course, in the video will be other theory pieces as flow theory, core gameplay loops, interesting choices, and fairness to be discussed, but it will be too much for a theory, so I will touch these slightly during the practical part. Now, when the main theory is discussed, let's dive into the prototype development process. I started with the paper prototype and found it much faster to create and playtest, which results in a much faster iterative design. I started to implement different parts of the game to be able to replicate the initial concept. Of course, as this paper prototype, some things as animations, complex logic, mechanics were abstract, as it's close to impossible to test outcome of introducing them on paper. Moreover, some simple mechanics as health system or shooting was also abstracted in order to get rid of small unnecessary details, which most likely to be changed during digital prototype development anyway. After I made players, enemies, some elevators, and finally some objectives, I also colored them to appropriate colors to have them some visual language. What do I mean under appropriate colors? There is a research paper which discusses the perception of colors into games as it applies to good and evil. As you may see, the red and black colors are more probably to be enemies, while green, white, and blue are more probably to be friendly. As previously discussed, the corruption itself should change narrative implications and players' relationship with the main character. To do so, I have created a background story.
In 2088, in one country, we have a dictator who wants to enforce his regime. As people started to make complaints about the life quality, he minimized the food amount and sent spies so that the people barely survive. Unfortunately for him, there is a secret resistance group that trying to get as many people in group as possible to overthrow his regime. To get new people aboard, you as a resistance group participant try to save people lives by giving them papers with all the information about where people can get supplies and how, and what kind of help is requested in exchange.
As you might understand from the story, I have decided to add people you need to save from the dictator's regime. As a result of such change is that player will be more involved with the game and connected with the character itself. On this point, I have added alarm mechanic to increase tension of the game, as it was done in the original. The alarm increases the number of enemies as well as stops elevators from controlling for some time. Also, to add interesting choices, I have made doors as optional objectives that give little score to the player, while saving hostages give much more, but it's harder to get them. As an original game, I have enemies who follow the player. To diversify the gameplay, I have added a second type of enemy who will go only horizontally and won't follow players on different floors. At the same time, to save fairness, this type of enemy will move a little bit faster than the first ones. To make the game even more interesting to explore, I have also added horizontal lifts. On this point, I thought my prototype is ready. It's presented to two groups of different people. While the first group used no specific approach, another one used the hat approach. Unfortunately, as hat people did not have real experience using this approach, not a lot of feedback was given back. But the feedback that I found useful was, I do not feel risk. As a player, I lose interest in the game so fast. After this, I have added a new type of NPC who will take your help notes, but with a 25% chance will call enemy agents. I called it civilian. Also, I have added high score table to make person interested in a game and try to beat his own or other people's scores. On the other hand, other group members provided multiple ways to improve the game. These were pickup items, some doors being locked, maybe you need to find the key. By activating the door, teleport to another one. After I thought about the core gameplay loops, I decided not to have any pickup items and not to include locked doors, as a feeling of fast and concentrated gameplay might miss. But I like the idea of teleporting to another door as another corruption. After a little paper testing, I decided doors will be two types, safe and unsafe, and when a person will try to use any door, there's a 50% chance of being teleported to the safe one. On my paper prototype, I show this by throwing the cube. If it's more than 3, we teleport to it. The last thing I will touch is game choosiness. I have created a mood board where I specify which choosiness elements I want to use, such as dynamic score counter in Crash Bandicoot, squash and stretch animations, as done in Super Meat Boy, muzzle flashes on shooting, damage responsiveness, and a couple of other elements you might see on your screen. Overall, you might say why I, as a game designer, need to implement paper prototyping. I did not see any popular game produced using this approach. Yes, you most probably did not, but what even companies will tell you? It's never a topic, usually only game designers will talk about. Still, there is a couple of tabletop games, and according to Kotaku, Hearthstone was one of the games which used paper prototyping. If it's not enough for you, what is? Digital prototype. Of course, most, if not all, the digital games you know have started with digital prototypes one day. In the start, it does not have any astonishing looking sprites, audio, or have even by gameplay, but it's all part of iterations. There is an example called Sea of Thieves, which in 2014 was in early development stage and then moved to development stage. You might see it was eternally tested, but did not have most of nowadays amazing looking animations, hilarious heroes with unique outlook. First, I started implementing basic mechanics such as camera movement, physics of player, jump system using animation curves, elevators, escalators, health systems, and shooting system. I also have added a high score system with a small change that even if your score is equal with current top 1, you will replace his entry. So if someone is playing later and have the same score, their score will be replace your entry. By this, I try to stimulate the player to play more often and try to achieve the best result possible, even more. I also have added so-called coyote time with possibility to jump to ensure controls feedback of the player. After I have implemented most of these, I started to implement different entities logic such as hostage, civilian, and enemies. At this point, I understood that two types of enemies are not required, and the player feels frustrated from a lot of details in the game, and multiple types of enemies will make it only worse. After deciding this, I moved to developing UI, sprites, and generating different sound and music effects. Of course, there are differences between digital and paper prototypes, and some ideas that were easy to implement on paper and in the head turned out not to be interesting and hard to implement as in real life. Overall, paper prototype might be used for design-driven development, testing small features and how they would affect user feeling, for example using MDA framework. As a result, I find paper prototyping might help to guide management decision in development phase because of clearer feedback, multiple design exploration, and faster iterative approach. For example, if management want to implement monetization, game designers could test possible solution which will not only earn money, but also provide players innovative gameplay feeling. Other case, if few game designers have different vision on how particular mechanic should be implemented, they could do paper prototyping and present to their colleagues to get feedback and implement in a way of majority wants. On the other hand, personally, I would use digital prototype for professional appearance, as example for selling the game idea, or in case when I have multiple sub-companies and I need to establish single vision of end product. Additionally, I would use digital prototype only if I have team with strong technical skills. As I'm not the best artist, my sprites and animations are not the best ones, and many bugs appear because of switching between them. Also, my audio composer skills are even worse, so I've used 8-bit music and sound generators, even without trying to implement them on my own. Because of this, they do not enforce the feeling of the game as hard as they should. But after a week of developing UI, animation, and sounds, I started on the hardest part, getting it all together. Until that, I had simply a level with a few objects in place, few spawners, and simple UI on top. As a result, much redundant code was written, but I was so happy when it did work. After some playtesting of the mechanics, finding weird bugs and things to improve, I started on level design. The first two levels were intended to be tutorials that would describe the gameplay aspect to the player, such as alarms, enemies, elevators, portals, and level finishers. After implementing those and another 5 levels, I have playtested my build, and after receiving feedback, I was satisfied with it, even there are many things to improve. I like the idea of paper prototyping, even found that a good outcome is expected. Even some ideas cannot be implemented in the case of team of one because of lacking knowledge or technical aspects, which makes it more abstract and useless without a person with the technical experience implementing these. My thoughts regarding the game are that the game is close to minimal viable product state. First, the game itself might be much more polished by including more appropriate sounds and animations. Moreover, tutorial using text is outdated and should be provided using visual language or throughout the gameplay. Even arcade games were lacking it at all. Even the game has some randomized behaviors such as spawning hostages in random location, the game becomes mundane after playing a few times. Overall, I won't play this game in era of indie, AA, and AAA titles, but I cannot predict such game success if it would be released in era of arcade games. That's it. Thanks so much. Have a nice day.